The fortress of Gesell Prime drifted in stable orbit above the twilight line of Erixus 4, its obsidian towers casting segmented shadows across the fractured blue of the planet below. Inside its tribunal chamber, the walls curved inward, like the carapace of an extinct predator, polished smooth and silver-veined, lit by cold spectral bands that shimmered with each breath of artificial atmosphere. Seated behind the crescent dais were 5 Erixi adjudicators, each armored in ceremonial plate etched with ancestral sigils, symbols of command, conquest, and caution. The room was silent, save for the muted hiss of the environmental controls and the soft metallic clink as their taloned fingers tapped across embedded interface pads. They did not look at each other. Their eyes were fixed on the door. It slid open with a sound like an exhale. Draven Malk entered the chamber without pause, without guard, without fear. He wore no insignia, no emblems of rank or authority, just a dark pressure suit sealed to the collarbone, its material worn smooth from long use. In his left hand, he carried a rectangular archive core, heavy and unadorned, its casing matte with micro-ablation scars. His expression was unreadable, eyes sunken but alert, mouth a flat line, every movement measured as if he had already walked this path 1,000 times. When he reached the circle of light cast at the chamber center, he stopped, placed the core at his feet, and raised his gaze. The tribunal did not speak for 6 seconds. Then the chair stood. The matter before this tribunal is designated Crisis Inquiry 09, the Erixi announced in their native tongue, translated instantly via subdermal relay. Subject, Silver Shard collapse. 25,000 Erixi personnel lost. No confirmed human engagement. No conventional tactical precedents. No atmospheric weapon signatures. No valid predictive model. 17 command chains failed simultaneously. The chair's crest flickered with embedded data light. We summoned you, Analyst Malk, because your operational role appears linked to every unexplained strategic shift during the late war. You were not a general. You led no battalion. Yet your simulations preceded every recorded failure of our strategic integrity. You are not here as a diplomat. This is not a hearing. You are here because we do not understand what you did to us. Malk gave a slow nod, then bent at the waist and activated the archive core. It emitted a low-pitched click and began projecting a soft, static-free beam into the chamber center. A circle of black light, flickering with embedded data fragments, expanded silently beneath his boots. The tribunal leaned forward slightly, subconsciously, as though the shadows might contain a confession. Malk's voice, when it came, was soft, not submissive, surgical. You lost, he said, because you followed what you believed we believed you would do. One of the tribunal members hissed. Through their gill vents, a minor breach of decorum. Malk ignored it. His fingers moved across the flat surface of the archive core, and the projection coalesced into a timeline. Bare bones, no narration, only flashes of battlefield telemetry, satellite overlays and Erixi deployment patterns collapsing inward like crumpled architecture. He let the silence stretch. Let me be clear, he continued. This is not a demonstration of power. It's a post-mortem. You asked for cause. I'm showing you the first symptom. The footage froze on a wide-field shot of the Arcturian Shelf, an icy basin carved into the crust of the planet Erixus 9. In the image, hundreds of Erixi infantry were repositioning along ridgelines, artillery emplacements shifting orientation, automated supply drones rerouting midair. There were no Terran signatures, no explosions, no detected threats. And yet the formation fractured, collapsed inward, then vanished from orbital telemetry 3 hours later. There were no human soldiers within 2,000 kilometers, Malk said, eyes still fixed on the image. No kill teams, no snipers, no strike craft, just your own command protocols reacting to ghost data. One of the tribunal members activated a viewing node, zooming in on a convoy trail. You claim this was a miscalibration? A trick of terrain? No, Malk shook his head once. I claim your validation loops were recursive. We introduced nothing. We simply corrupted what was already there. The tribunal fell still again, but not in confusion. It was something deeper, Recognition followed by the slow, spreading discomfort of implications previously unconsidered. They had combed every centimeter of those battlefields after the war. They had tested for nanoagents, cloaked drones, atmospheric distortions. What they had never considered was that themselves, their own protocols, their own command hierarchies, had become the vectors of collapse. The archive shifted again. This time, the screen displayed a conference room on Earth, years earlier. Malk sat at a long table flanked by three other humans, none of them military in appearance. Behind them stood a wall of tactical matrices, behavioral charts, and linguistic syntax trees. A voice, unidentified, spoke off-screen. They will adapt if we target infrastructure directly. We need to find where their adaptation stops, where their hierarchy locks them in place. Identify the fracture points built into their culture. Another analyst leaned forward. That means manipulating perception, not forced projection. Correct, Malk had said in the recording. We build collapse from the inside, not through resistance, through misalignment. The tribunal watched, unmoving. Back in the present, Malk crouched and pulled another data capsule from a compartment at the base of the archive. He loaded it without comment. The chamber lights dimmed slightly and a new sequence began to play. Thermal. Overlays from low-orbit monitors, showing terrain warping with heat signatures where no soldier stood. The shadows moved. Arixi artillery repositioned. Command clusters dissolved. And still, no Terran boots touched ground. I will show you the mechanisms, Malk said, but not to mock. You're not the only ones who suffered from this. You just haven't realized it yet. As the projection widened to reveal 7 more sites, each suffering identical collapses without combat, the tribunal members leaned back in near unison. The silence was no longer procedural. It was stunned. The chair adjusted a vocal relay. You said symptom. Are you implying this was only the first phase? Malk did not answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his gaze, his eyes now sharper, colder. What you called the Silver Shard collapse, he said, wasn't a mistake. It wasn't sabotage. It was design. You weren't defeated. You were overwritten. The archive core pulsed once. The lights returned. Malk stepped back, hands folded behind his back. Now, he said, let's talk about Project Oubliette. The chamber held its breath. The air felt thinner. And still, no one moved to stop him. The silence after Malk's final line wasn't long, but it was weighted, less with outrage and more with recalibration. The Arixi tribunal, seasoned in warfare and hardened by command, did not bristle as expected. They processed. Behind their elongated eyes, behind the polished obsidian armor and the ceremonial rank bands, something cold moved, the realization that their defeat may have begun before a single soldier deployed. One of the tribunal members leaned forward at last, voice modulated and sharp, as though by habit rather than need. What technology caused this collapse? Malk didn't blink. You're asking the wrong question, he said. It wasn't a device. It was a doctrine. Project Oubliette wasn't designed to kill you. It was designed to convince you you'd already lost. The chamber dimmed slightly as the archive core engaged a new layer. Unlike the dramatic telemetry of battlefield overlays, this one was subtle. Columns of numerical deltas, freight routing logs, and fleet resource distribution matrices. The visuals were dry, inert, nothing that screamed weaponry. But the longer they played, the more the anomalies stood out. Supply convoys redirected by half a sector, ammunition loads swapped for obsolete calibers, field engineers deployed to staging areas that had been decommissioned cycles earlier. The changes were microscopic, each less than a percentage point. Yet over time, they bent the Arixi logistical spine until it twisted under its own weight. We hijacked the validation pathways in your rear echelon systems, Malk explained, stepping forward. Our orbital stealth satellites mirrored your fleet identification tags, subtly enough to bypass your checksum thresholds. We didn't need to override your logistics. We just made your system trust itself slightly too much. Another adjudicator's clause retracted halfway, a gesture of disquiet. That would take cycles of infiltration. Malk shook his head once. Not cycles, just confidence. You broadcasted your supply cadence every quarter rotation. We modeled your confirmation habits and found the delay window. 2 hours was all we needed. The archive shifted again. Now, panoramic atmospheric towers set into barren terrain across contested worlds. They stood like civilian infrastructure. Weather monitors, seismic stations, even cultural survey beacons. Each had been deployed under diplomatic agreements signed during the first ceasefire. Harmless, helpful, friendly. But they weren't. These towers didn't scan, Malk said. They emitted. As the tribunal watched, a new layer appeared. Vibrational maps across tectonic plates, simulating the footfalls of armored divisions moving across terrain. Each signature had been tuned to resemble Terran formations based on historic deployments. No human troops were ever sent, but the Arixi, detecting the seismic disturbance, repositioned entire regiments to counter phantom battalions. You spent 6 standard months fighting shadows, Malk said. You didn't just lose territory, you abandoned it. The tribunal chair leaned forward, hands pressed flat to the table. His voice, when it came, no longer carried the dispassion of duty. You impersonated war, Malk met his gaze. Correct. We built the illusion of engagement. The battlefield responded accordingly. Another adjudicator activated a side panel, pulling up comparative statistics from the war's middle phase. Movement reports, artillery estimates, defensive overwatch patterns. The alignment was undeniable. Everywhere the towers had operated, Arexi forces had redistributed with nearly identical reflex. There were no human casualties in those zones, because there had been no humans. One of the younger tribunal members shifted uncomfortably, claws tapping against the armrest in a subconscious rhythm. Even if your methods distorted signals, even if your machines fabricated data, how did you penetrate our base command structure? We operate with strict internal insulation. No foreign systems are allowed in operational theaters. Malk paused, and for the first time, his expression shifted. Not smug, not triumphant, but faintly regretful. You asked for aid during the ceasefire at Vern Threshold, he said. We complied. Images appeared of humanitarian drones, unarmed, coated in neutral white, carrying medical payloads, structural scanners, engineering kits. They'd been gifts, sent in response to Arixi formal request for support in re-establishing forward bases after a volcanic destabilization event. The tribunal remembered the incident. It had been a diplomatic softening point. Terran analysts and Arixi engineers had exchanged protocols. Repairs had commenced. Spirits had, momentarily, lifted. Malk continued. We embedded predictive heuristics into those drones. Not viruses, not malware. Just code modules designed to observe and adapt. They studied your repair routines, your diagnostic patterns, your fail-safe hierarchy. He paused. And then, at pre-designated triggers, they acted. The projected footage now showed maintenance bays mid-conflict, Arixi logistics personnel running standard diagnostics, unaware that their systems had begun issuing command updates outside established authority chains. False alerts, fabricated damage reports, recalled units. Phantom malfunctions that rerouted replacement parts and created cascading shortages at the front, and all of it hidden within the normal tolerances of system redundancy. You trusted the machines, Malk said quietly, because they told you what you expected to hear. The chamber chilled, not literally but perceptually, a kind of moral drop in temperature, as if the air itself recoiled. These were not weapons by traditional measure, no kinetic impact, no biochemical payload, just understanding, just kindness delivered at the right time in the right shape, curated to exploit trust. You violated no treaties, one adjudicator whispered, not to Malk but almost to himself. No, Malk said. You invited us in. A long silence followed. Longer than before, the tribunal members had been prepared for orbital rail strikes, for atmospheric distortion, for stealth incursions, but not for hospitality as invasion, not for charity re-engineered into collapse. In their culture, the gift was sacred, unquestionable. To corrupt that was not just strategic, it was existential. "How do you defend against kindness?" the youngest among them asked, though no one answered. The archive core dimmed again. No further data was shown. The point had landed, but the moment fractured with a sudden slam of the tribunal chair's fist against the table. No ceremonial calm now. The force cracked the surface with a sharp, crystalline pop. "And Silver Shard!" The words reverberated off the walls. The tone was no longer measured. It was personal. Pained. The collapse had haunted their command for 14 years. 25,000 lost. No trace. No explanation. Now the implication that it had followed the same logic, illusion, not fire, demanded confirmation. Malk did not reply right away. Instead, his shoulders rose. Once. Barely. And for the first time, he exhaled. Not as a response, but as memory. His voice, when it came again, was quieter than before. "Silver Shard," he said, "wasn't an operation." He turned toward the archive core. It was a conclusion. The archive core reactivated with a low, steady pulse as Malk adjusted its feed. This time, the projection didn't begin with terrain scans or signal charts. It opened on raw black box footage. The tribunal chamber dimmed as the visual emerged. Interior. Views from Arixi combat suits. Command overlays, glowing faint blue across curved visors. The flicker of hued data cascading down. In each recording, the timestamp read the same standard cycle. Location tags read, "Silver Shard Expanse." The tribunal leaned forward as the full playback initialized. They were about to see what none of them had ever seen. The final 72 hours before an entire regional army disappeared, without combat. One of the helmet feeds showed an Arixi officer, his breathing steady, posture upright, surrounded by platoon leaders taking last-minute routing commands before what should have been a routine forward position hold. The sound was calm, structured, no sense of urgency, no panic. Then, without warning, the commander's HUD began to distort. Notifications rolled in. "Unit Delta 5 breaking ranks. Unauthorized withdrawal." A visual popped up, grainy, red-tinted, showing movement across a ridge. But the thermal trail was misaligned. No unit had been scheduled there. The officer hesitated. "What you're seeing now," Malk said from his position at the center of the tribunal floor, "is the first trigger event. No human involvement, just synthetic overlays injected from within the command mesh." The visual shifted to another helmet cam, this time a comms technician. His HUD lit up with emergency fallback orders signed by his direct superior. The tribunal member controlling the interface paused and blinked. "That officer was confirmed dead 70 hours prior," he muttered. "Yes," Malk said, "but the signature was still live in the network. We mapped loyalty routing trees and preserved key personas. When the node reached decision crisis depth, the injectors prioritized trust hierarchy over present inputs." The tribunal sat in stunned quiet as more footage rolled. Unit leaders barked orders against phantom threats, enemy mortar fire that hadn't occurred, air support delays that weren't real. In one suit, an officer's HUD showed an alert that his right flank had collapsed. Another showed a recall order from Central Command marked high urgency, but no confirmation loops followed. There were no counter orders, no challenges, and across all the feeds the patterns began to repeat: contradiction, confusion, and silence. These injectors, Malk explained, weren't weapons. They didn't damage hardware or corrupt files. They observed. Then when embedded patterns met pre-modeled psychological thresholds, they nudged. Not enough to trigger alarm, just enough to tilt trust. The tribunal watched the disintegration unfold, not with the explosion of war, but the silence of something forgotten. Units pulled back without being attacked. Forward scouts vanished, not because they were intercepted, but because they received falsified reroute instructions into terrain that no longer had recovery beacons. Medical transports redirected themselves to assist casualties that hadn't happened. And logistics began folding inward. Ammunition delivered to the wrong grid, armor detached from infantry support, AI stabilization routines overridden with misaligned engagement timing. The Silver Shard collapse wasn't a battle. It was a coordinated dissonance spiral. One of the adjudicators finally leaned back, breathing shallow through a tight mandibular valve. "How many soldiers did you deploy?" he asked quietly, though the answer came before Malk could speak. The footage cut to a low-orbit insertion pod. The only one. A single Terran drop unit. No combat payload. No high-yield war gear. Just infiltration harnesses, cognitive injectors, and real-time environmental modeling gear. Their mission, to interface with previously gifted maintenance modules embedded in the Silver Shard base months earlier. The moment of contact was undetectable. Just a flicker on the sensor feed as a diagnostic drone accepted a new command input. The unit exfiltrated before dawn. No engagement, no detection, nothing left behind. After that, Malk said, your army undid itself. The data projection faded, now replaced by a growing casualty graph. But it didn't show deaths, it showed absences. Units listed as disconnected, unresponsive, or logistically misaligned. Over 3 days, the number reached 25,000. "We didn't kill your army," Malk said, eyes forward, tone level. "You abandoned it to avoid shame." The words hung in the air like a rupture in gravity. To the human ear, it might have sounded clinical, but to the tribunal, it was far more precise. In Arixi military tradition, honor was not a social trait, it was tactical infrastructure. Orders could not be openly challenged without invoking clan protocols. Public contradiction required formal retraction under ancestral code, a process that took hours. In the chaos of a perceived battlefield, that delay was untenable, so no one contradicted. No one reversed. Once a false command reached a critical node, it traveled downward without interruption. "We didn't introduce confusion," Malk continued. "We introduced decisions that required contradiction, and that alone was enough." He said nothing more. He didn't have to. The tribunal had already connected the final implication. What had seemed like a systems failure wasn't. It had been a cultural exploit, a linguistic injection targeting a belief system structured around hierarchy and perception. And the method hadn't required superior weaponry or numbers. Just knowledge. Just timing. The younger adjudicator stood abruptly, voice rasping with disbelief. "There was never a battle." "No," Malk said. "There was a convergence." "For what purpose?" asked another. "You could have struck us then. Annihilated us. Your path was open." Malk's silence didn't deflect. It echoed. The tribunal began to shift, no longer studying the man in the center as a tactician. Something else had formed now in their eyes. Not hatred, not accusation, but something colder. He had not broken their lines. He had unstitched their identity, and now belatedly, they recognized it. "It wasn't the tech," one of them said, almost to himself. "It was us." That finally made Malk blink. "Yes," he said. The lights in the archive core dimmed again. No data followed. There was no need. The footage had done its work. The tribunal did not speak further. Not because they lacked questions, but because they were beginning to realize that those questions no longer had answers in the language they once used. The collapse had never been a confrontation, it had been a mirror, one designed to show them what they could not face in themselves. And Earth had only held it up. The tribunal chamber remained dimmed, as if the light itself had recoiled from what it had witnessed. No voices stirred. The silence wasn't tactical, it was wounded. Even the ambient systems, calibrated to maintain a strict hum of operational neutrality, seemed subdued. One of the adjudicators, older than the others, finally stirred. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the vocal relay embedded in the collar of his armor. His words broke the silence not with authority, but with something far more brittle. "You could have destroyed us." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation hollowed out by disbelief. For years, the Arixi had justified the sudden end of the war with their own theories. Resource exhaustion, strategic parity, internal Terran collapse. To learn now that Earth had remained silent not out of necessity, but by design was something their doctrine had no place to categorize. "You could have erased our command, our cities, our entire sector chain. Why didn't you finish it?" Draven Malk didn't move for several seconds. He let the question hang, not for effect, but because this was the moment he'd expected since the summons. He knelt beside the archive core, and inserted a final capsule. The chamber shifted again, projection rising not with footage, but with simulations. They were cleaner, clinical. The data was sharper than war footage, because it wasn't war, it was potential, modeled futures. What you're seeing, Malk began, is Directive Zero. Earth ran it at the midpoint of the conflict, when we gathered enough data to project conquest scenarios. We simulated every total victory path available. The visuals played out: orbital bombardment arcs, systemic decapitation of the Arixi leadership, strategic occupation. The figures accelerated, showing initial success, followed by something worse than military resistance. Malk didn't narrate this part. He didn't need to. The Arixi tribunal saw it with their own eyes. Martyr networks forming in the ashes. Generational cults rising from the ruins. Sectors destabilized for decades. Not despite Earth's victory, but because of it. Destruction, Malk said, invites meaning. We modeled what happens when your people lose territory, leaders, doctrine, and find purpose in loss. You're not unique in that. Neither are we. The projection changed. Now it showed a barren field on the edge of what had once been a shrine fortress, a hallowed site in Arixi culture, where command oaths were sworn beneath the tri-lobed banners of ancestral lineages. The structure was gone, not bombed, not burned, gone. In its place, a mirror field. Dozens of crystalline sheets arranged in a spiral, angled to catch the rising sun of the planet's rotation. When Arixi recon drones approached, they sent back only warped, fragmented images of themselves. No enemy, no symbol, just reflection. Distorted, shifting, centerless. This is what we left behind, Malk said. Not ruin, not ash. Doubt. He stepped into the projection field, let it spill across his face like starlight diffused through fog. Where your culture looked for aftermath, we gave you recursion. Every attempt to process defeat would yield only the impossibility of understanding it. We didn't desecrate your shrines. We made them non-functional. Another projection, another site, a training citadel, once ringed with sacred geometry used in Arixi tactical instruction, its angles thought to represent divine alignment between will and form. Now each segment had been shifted by less than a degree, enough that calculations based on the layout yielded mathematically impossible vectors. It wasn't defacement. It was deliberate ambiguity. No part of the site was visibly damaged, but its meaning no longer worked. We taught your commanders not to trust their own language, Malk said. It wasn't metaphor. It was procedural. The glyphs used in command encoding, once considered sacred inflections, tied to ancestral syntax, had been manipulated subtly by Earth's semantic teams. Battlefield overlays showed orders that, while syntactically valid, could now be interpreted in mutually exclusive ways depending on regional dialect. The result wasn't chaos. It was obedience pulled in opposite directions. Ritual itself had been weaponized, used not as a banner, but as a wedge. One of the adjudicators whispered something in a low, vibrating tone, untranslated. Another lowered his head into his palms, claws extended, breathing shallow. These were not military defeats. These were ritual inversions. And that, more than any fleet engagement or troop loss, was why their sectors had disbanded. There had been no enemy to strike, no doctrine to rally behind. What had once unified them, faith in hierarchy, in encoded meaning, had been made inert. The oldest among them stood now, slowly, as if rising through gravity, more hostile than space. You didn't end the war, he said, voice rough. You erased its meaning. Malk didn't contradict him. He simply closed the projection with a wave. The room returned to stillness, though something vital had changed. The tribunal was no longer evaluating Malk as an analyst. They weren't even seeing him as a representative of Earth. He was something else now, a vector of unmaking, a living artifact of their cultural undoing, and he'd done it not with force, but with restraint. Do you regret what you did? The question came from the youngest, spoken not with challenge, but with something approaching the kind of sorrow that had no name in any language spoken between them. For a moment it lingered, unanswered, hanging between them like a live wire suspended in atmosphere. Malk didn't respond. He neither nodded nor shook his head. He didn't reach for the archive core. He didn't lift his chin in defiance or bow in apology. He simply remained still, composed, silent, and unreadable. And in that silence, the Erixi heard the only answer Earth had ever truly given them. The air in the tribunal chamber had turned leaden. Not in temperature nor pressure. Those were strictly regulated, but in something else, something molecular that no climate system could calibrate. Erixi adjudicators sat motionless. Their ceremonial crests, once alive with adaptive shimmer, had dulled to a static gray blue. They had no more questions. None would matter. Draven Malk stood alone, archive core inert at his feet, arms loosely folded behind his back, not in defiance, but in containment. His presence no longer demanded analysis. It demanded distance. The chair of the tribunal rose, not with flourish, not with ceremony. Simply rose, adjusted the collar of his ranking armor, and without preamble activated his internal relay. The pronouncement came in 3 clipped tones. The human translators caught the words easily, but the nuance was alien, ancient, more than a designation, less than a sentence. Cognitive Hazard Class 3. Directive Varn 9 invoked. Earth is now sealed. There was no debate, no vote, just silence thickened by finality. The term was known in interstellar diplomacy. Rare, reserved for contagions not of biology or weaponry, but of thought, systems capable of destabilizing belief, identity, cohesion. The designation meant Earth's existence, its culture, even its methods of inference, were now considered a vector of strategic disintegration. Interpretive warfare. No missiles, no plagues, just meaning turned feral. Under Clause Varn 9, all diplomatic ports to Earth were closed, archives scrubbed, communication relays disabled, treaties erased by necessity. No species under Erixi protection, no ally, no client civilization, was permitted contact with Terran systems. Not because of hostility, but because Earth was now categorized as a zone where ideas did not behave, where logic itself had once entered, fractured, and failed to reemerge. No one stood to deliver this to Malk. No eye contact passed. He was escorted out by 2 silent functionaries in sealed armor, not as prisoner, not as diplomat, but as if he were already a sealed file, an obsolete node, scheduled for cold storage. No one touched him. No word was exchanged. He stepped through the doors and disappeared into the sterilized corridor. Behind him, the chamber lights reset. The war was over, but it had not ended in surrender or treaty. It had ended in avoidance. 2 weeks later, Malk stood alone at the edge of a snow-choked bluff overlooking the North Atlantic. The observation outpost assigned to him was embedded in the basalt cliffs of northern Iceland, indistinguishable from the surrounding stone except for the faint warmth of exhaust condensation that rose into the frigid air. No security detail, no visitors, no recognition. His clearance had been quietly revoked, his account sealed, his activity log scrubbed. Officially, he was listed as a Category B asset with no further operational engagement. Unofficially, no one wanted to talk to him, not even Earth. Inside the outpost, the walls were bare, screens inactive unless summoned, furniture sterile, food synthesized. Malk spent his days reviewing fallout metrics. Suicide rates among Erixi veterans were climbing, clustered around former command centers. The patterns were uneven, illogical, spikes following specific anniversaries that no longer appeared on official calendars. Earth's sociolinguistic analysts suspected ritual memory trauma. No clear term existed for it, just a growing pulse of psychological debris where meaning used to reside. And on the human side, the cost was subtler, but real. The analysts who had helped Malk design Project Oubliette, those who'd mapped cultural fracture points, who'd woven the mirror fields, who'd inserted semantic disruption into glyph syntax, were burning out. Cognitive fatigue, dissociative episodes, a pattern of unresolvable empathy backlash. Earth had won the war, yes, but the designers had stared too long into the pattern they'd shattered, and now it stared back. Malk never requested reassignment. He never protested the outposting. Each morning he opened the same 7 logs, read them line by line, and ran silent projections of Erixi internal comms traffic. He never spoke during these sessions. No audio was required. He studied the patterns not for victory, but for decay. He never smiled, never wrote, never answered the inquiries from Earth's psychological monitoring team. He'd stopped sending reports after the first quarter cycle. The final one had been one line: "We solved the problem. The symptoms remain." On a frost-laced evening, near the end of the cycle, Malk stood alone inside the observation deck's inner archive room. One classified file remained unopened. It had been delivered the night he returned to Earth. Encrypted, eyes only, irrevocable once accessed. The label bore no operational tag, just a single word: continuation. He hovered his hand over the panel for a long moment. Then slowly, deliberately, he closed the terminal without accessing it. He turned away from the glowing screen and walked back into the quiet stone corridors, the sea's distant thunder muffled beneath meters of ancient rock. He never opened the file. Some victories weren't meant to be understood. There was no celebration, no broadcast, no orbiting war monument. Earth's fleets never returned to Erixi space, not even for reconnaissance. The war, as far as the public would know, ended in equilibrium. No footage was ever leaked. No parades, no veterans told their stories because there were none. Only specialists whose clearances outlived their relevance. The Strategic Deterrence Board decommissioned all open-facing dossiers relating to the Erixi conflict within 3 cycles. Earth moved on in silence, not because it lacked victory, but because acknowledging that victory would mean reanimating the very systems it had chosen to disassemble. In the outer systems of the Erixi Commonwealth, it was more than silence. It was erasure. The Silver Shard collapse was removed from tactical education modules. Memorials were repurposed into civic platforms. The word Terran was redacted from historical archives under the guise of treaty compliance. In primary schooling, children were taught that the war had ended due to mutual exhaustion, though no official names were listed for the final confrontation. There were no dates, no battles, just a phase shift in the middle of history, an ellipsis that neither began nor ended. And yet the whispers endured. They passed among repair crews on forgotten moons, among traders whose roots touched abandoned planetary rings. The stories varied. Some spoke of human warships that flickered like ghosts across sensor range. Others claimed to have encountered combursts that played back only the listener's own voice, distorted and recursive. Some remembered commanders who went silent mid-transmission, their minds shredded not by weapons, but by contradiction. The most cautious never spoke the name Earth, not out of fear of reprisal, but out of a quiet, ancestral instinct not to summon what could not be understood. In time, Malk's name vanished from most registries. He received no recognition, no medal, not even a classified footnote. He died in the outpost buried beneath Icelandic basalt, his vitals flatlining during an unscheduled system update. There was no funeral, no personnel review. His body was not recovered, not because Earth refused, but because no one was sent. In his final living entry, the local relay node received a single instruction: terminate instance, archive cold. The system obeyed, his file closed, but his work didn't. In a sealed complex buried beneath the South Pacific tectonic boundary, a facility marked only by a grid reference that didn't exist on any civilian map, Project Oubliette continued, not as a war doctrine, but as an epistemological framework. Earth's psychological and linguistic warfare divisions no longer developed weapons to disrupt enemy systems. They developed models to disrupt enemy certainty. The goal wasn't to cause pain or loss. It was to erode context, to devalue proof, to create theaters where truth itself could not stabilize. The operational command adopted the same axiom that had closed the Erixi War: never fire if collapse is cheaper. When confronted with threats, Earth no longer defaulted to arms. Instead, it evaluated symbolic architecture, mythic load-bearing assumptions, behavioral rituals. Strategic AI programs were retrained not to find vulnerabilities in armor, but in meaning. And if meaning proved fragile enough, Earth never sent a soldier, never deployed a ship, never declared intent. Across the stars, species continued to fight each other, over land, over pride, over gods. But they did not fight Earth. They couldn't. There was no front line, no fleet formation, no pattern to predict. Only the silent, patient presence of a civilization that knew how to wait for belief to exhaust itself. And so, for all the data lost, one truth remained preserved. Malk had never asked for legacy. Earth had never declared victory. There was no banner, no anthem, no post-war doctrine to celebrate. Only a whispered lesson passed between the analysts who still studied his patterns, who still sat in dark rooms illuminated only by recursive models of collapsed civilizations. Because the only thing more terrifying than being defeated is realizing you were never meant to fight at all. What do you think is more dangerous? Losing a war or never realizing you were in one? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Was Earth justified in using silence as its sharpest weapon? If this story gave you chills, hit that subscribe button. Like, share, and tell us. What would you have done if you were sitting in that tribunal?